I recently saw The Last Jedi. Upon my first watch, I thought it was okay-ish and felt that I liked it a little better than The Force Awakens. But then as I reflected upon it, I realized that a lot of what appealed to me was mostly the better use of that classic Star Wars music. The more I considered the plot and the characters in The Last Jedi, the more it started to come apart for me. While there was some good, much of the movie seemed to have missed the mark, especially for longtime fans like myself. As I went looking for reviews, I discovered that many of you out there felt very much the same way. As some of you know, one of my recent projects that I've been trying my hand at is writing epic fantasy. Also, thanks to my long career in video games, I have quite a lot of experience in dealing with how to treat beloved intellectual properties and how to craft new stories that flesh out those universes while still remaining true to what has come before. And so, I decided to give myself a little exercise. If I had been handed the script for The Last Jedi back when it was in production and been asked to provide my thoughts on it, but also told that the main plot points and scenes were locked in and couldn't be significantly changed, what would I say? Could The Last Jedi be made more appealing to longtime fans with just some fairly minor script changes while still keeping most of what was already in place? As I reflected on it, I discovered that with only a dozen or so fairly minor changes to some key scenes, that I think the entire reception of the movie, especially by long-term fans, could have been much improved. And so, in that spirit, here are the 12 script changes that I think would have made The Last Jedi a much better movie while still remaining true to the general framework that is the film as it has been released. I'm not talking about a total fanboy rewrite here, just about making some small changes in dialogue and scenes that I think could have had a very big and positive impact. Oh, and please note, spoilers abound in all that follows. Absolutely do not watch this video if you haven't already seen the film. All right, enough with the preface. Let's dive in. At the beginning of the film, we have a bunch of transports fleeing from a discovered resistance base. This leads to a sequence where Poe Dameron leads an attack on the Star Destroyer that is bombarding the planet and destroying the fleeing transports as they are in transit. Because I'm trying to change the film as little as possible, I'd say that we could mostly leave this sequence alone, but I would recommend adding in a short sequence at this point on board the cruiser, where Leia meets with just her senior officers, Admirals Holdo and Akbar, and they have a brief discussion. The gist of that discussion is that the rebels can't seem to get a break. Everywhere they run, and no matter how careful they are, the New Order finds them and arrives shortly thereafter. One of them, probably Admiral Holdo, suggests that maybe they have a spy among them who is feeding their movements to the bad guys. Leia admits that it is possible, and so she tells the other two that they must keep their future plans just among the three of them until they can figure out what is going on. This, of course, sets up some important foreshadowing to help bolster some future events, especially as it relates to Poe Dameron's future mutinous behavior. There's that weird and seemingly unnecessary sequence at the beginning of the film where Finn is plugged into some kind of medical device. He then gets up and goes wandering about trailing all these pipes and hoses with him until Poe Dameron comes over and helps him out. In the film, it really isn't clear why Finn is convalescing like that. With just a few additional lines, I think we could set up a whole subplot here that would ripple through several other scenes in a good way. Poe simply asks Finn something like, "So, how are you feeling? Still getting those headaches?" And Finn replies, "Yeah, sometimes, but the medical droids can't seem to figure out what's going on with me." Poe reassures him that everything will be okay, and we just move on from there. Of course, between this little addition and the one I just suggested before, you might get a sense of where I'm going with this. So, rather than having Luke toss his lightsaber over his shoulder when Rey arrives, and then playing Mr. Grumpy Pants for the next 20 minutes or so, what if Luke simply acted a bit more like a Jedi Master should act? and thereby change the whole tone for their interactions. So when Rey holds out the lightsaber, Luke is still gruff, but now he says something like, "It's about time you got here." And he looks her up and down and says, "We have a lot of work to do." Then, rather than having those next sequences of Rey following Luke all over the place begging him to train her, we switch those up just a little bit so that now Luke is bossing her around to do all kinds of seemingly mundane chores for him. So Luke's character is still old and grizzled, and we can still have most of those humorous moments, but the context is different. Luke becomes now more of a Mr. Miyagi character like from The Karate Kid. And we can see Rey's frustration rising as she doesn't get what any of all this hiking all over the island has to do with Jedi training. She finally throws a little hissy fit about the whole situation, and that, in turn, prompts Luke to chew her out for her impatience and then take her training to the next level, and where he can finally start teaching her about the Force properly. In the current film, we get the sense that Snoke is a pretty powerful and conniving Sith Lord, but we don't learn anything at all about him. So, as part of Luke's training for Rey, Luke could warn her about Snoke and about how Snoke turned Kylo Ren. Luke might remind Rey that there are many avenues in the Force and that Snoke has mastered using it to prey upon the minds and emotions of others, much like a Jedi mind trick, but Snoke has developed that ability to be 1,000 times more powerful and subtle. Snoke has learned how to project himself across any distance and gently whisper in the minds of others who are Force aware, even Luke's own former students. Now, Luke knew that something was up and could sense Snoke's presence infecting some of his students, but he couldn't quite place his finger on what was going on. So this is why Luke was out visiting his students on the night that he wound up fighting Kylo Ren. And rather than Luke thinking that he should just kill Kylo Ren because reasons, a rather un-Jedi-like thing to do, we could change this slightly so that when Luke enters Kylo's room, he actually sees Snoke's apparition there hovering over Kylo for the very first time. Luke hasn't seen anything like this before, and that's why Luke ignites his lightsaber. And it is also what wakes Kylo and leads to the whole confrontation and subsequent collapse of Luke's school. I think that this sort of Snoke is a master of mental manipulation explains not only Snoke's powers better, but it also makes more sense with both the characters of Kylo and Luke going forward throughout the rest of the film. A large part of the movie involves the New Order fleet bearing down on the rebels as they run from them. The setup here is that the New Order has developed some kind of ability to track their ships through hyperspace, and that the rebel fleet is almost out of fuel so that if they make any more jumps, they'll be sitting ducks. This explanation seems convoluted and sits wrong with me. I mean, if that's the case, why don't the rebels just hyperspace out in all different directions so that at least some of them can get away? Or why not choose a new jump destination for their fleet that is more favorable to their small ships, like an asteroid field? And since when is fuel a major plot point in the Star Wars universe? So, I think just a small tweak in the motivation for this long space chase sequence would make it work better and make more sense to the audience. My recommendation is that rather than it be all about fuel reserves and tracking the fleet through hyperspace, what if the big capital ship simply has developed some kind of hyperspace nullifier field that won't let anyone jump away? And because those big New Order ships are faster than the little rebel fleet, they're slowly overtaking them and picking off the stragglers as they close the distance. Note that this setup still works for all the other elements about the desperate plan for Finn and Rose. They still need to go find a hacker to help them breach the shields, and they still need to sneak on board to disable the nullifier. It seems simpler, more understandable, and even more dramatic to me than the explanation given that the rebel fleet could jump to hyperspace if it wanted to, but they're just so worried about fuel that they're not going to. If you're like me, Leia's magical powers after the command bridge gets obliterated and she and other leaders are blasted into space felt pretty out of place. Since when does the Force turn you into a space-flying superhero? So from a script and a Star Wars lore consistency standpoint, why not just have a bunch of leaders die in the explosion, but have Leia survive, but she's now in a sort of comatose state? Someone might even comment that Leia should be dead, but that the Force is sustaining her. As a plot point, this still fits, and it thrusts Admiral Holdo into command, and it puts Leia in the sickbay. Also, I think that it would have been good to have Admiral Akbar survive this attack as well, as a future script change I have in mind would give him a much better send-off than having him just blown out into space. If you're like me, that scene between Yoda and Luke just didn't sit right. Yoda's personality doesn't seem like the wise and insightful mentor that we've come to expect from him. Instead, for some reason, the writers went more with the goofy Muppet persona that he had when he was first assessing Luke back on Dagobah. All this makes it seem to me almost like Yoda was thrown in as a relatively meaningless cameo. Here's what I would change to make that scene feel more like Star Wars, and for it to have more importance to the overall storyline. First, remember that Luke is at an awful point now because he realizes that Kylo has been visiting with Rey, just like how Snoke had been doing with Kylo. Luke is also afraid that he has failed Rey as she has now left him before being properly trained. So, as you may recall, Luke goes up to burn the ancient Jedi books. But now, we change his motivation just a little and make it so that he does so not because he wants the Jedi Order to die, but rather because he realizes that he has opened himself up to the Force again, and that means that Snoke will soon be coming for them and for him. But, just like in the film, Luke discovers that he doesn't quite have the strength to go through with it. That's when Yoda appears and blasts everything to smithereens on his behalf. Luke looks to him for an explanation, and Yoda says something like, "In old books contain not the Force is, but rather in us does its focus find." This adds to the mystic nature of the Force, and it feels more right to me. Furthermore, at that point, Luke can lament to Yoda how he's failed Kylo and now also Ren. And again, Yoda should respond with some memorable and quotable words, something like, "Young Skywalker, so many years you have lived, and yet the greatest lesson have you still to learn. Of all teachers, failure the greatest is. And yet, one cannot truly fail until one the will to fight has lost." Yoda then fades away, and we see the strength of his parting words impact Luke. He goes from being distressed to getting that determined look in his eye. We know in that moment that Luke has made the decision to get back into the fight. One of the better scenes in the film is when Kylo brings Rey before Snoke. At this point, we finally get to see just how conniving and dangerous Snoke really is. If you've bought into my earlier script change regarding Snoke's powers and origins, I think this scene would feel even more intense as you know that Snoke is a master mental manipulator. To that end, a script change that I would have liked to have seen, and that I feel would have resonated with fans, is if part of Snoke's tempting and taunting of Rey is that he pulls a Darth Vader and sees in Rey's mind that she is conflicted about who her parents are. Snoke uses this to his advantage by saying something to the effect of, "You have such a high opinion of your teacher, and yet you cannot see the obvious. Your heroic master isn't without his faults. When he first started his school for the Jedi, he made the mistake of training a woman much too old to learn her lessons properly. A woman not unlike yourself." A forbidden closeness grew between them, much as it had before with Luke's own father, Darth Vader. And then one night, your master broke his Jedi vows and gave in to misguided passion. When the morning came, That woman was so ashamed of what she had done that she abandoned her training and fled. That former student was your mother, and Luke Skywalker is your father. Of course, this would hit Rey like a ton of bricks. She cries out, "No, you're lying." Snoke responds with, "Oh, am I? How else did you come to have these powers that you seem to have, And how does it make you feel that you were born in such shame and disgrace that your own father never sought to discover what had become of you, and instead remained behind to continue in his futile quest to raise yet another generation of pathetic Jedi? How do you feel? Abandoned? Worthless? Alone?" Rey's initial response might be horror as she contemplates this. But then she might remember Luke's warnings about Snoke and show some resolve and calm herself and say, "Even if it is true, I won't betray my legacy. The Jedi will live on, with or without me." Snoke might ponder this for a moment and then say, "Very well, as you wish. Your meaningless defiance will only serve to strengthen my power. Apprentice, you know what to do." And then at this point, we continue with Kylo's execution scene much as it currently exists in the film, including his betrayal of Snoke. After all, Kylo has learned his tricks from the master manipulator himself. I think this change regarding hints of Rey's origins would spark a lot of discussion about what the truth might actually be, and provide a lot of excitement for either confirmation or for a new revelation in the next film. Was Snoke lying to manipulate Rey? Or is there maybe some bit of truth to what he had to say? It would also change the dynamic of Rey and Luke's relationship, which could figure into another change that I have towards the end of the film. As you know, Kylo Ren tricks Snoke by pretending he's going to kill Rey, but then he actually kills Snoke instead. In the current version of the film, this almost seems like Kylo has a moment of weakness out of compassion for Rey or something. In any case, with Snoke dead, Kylo is now supposed to be the new big bad guy. And most of you probably agree with me that he just doesn't have the presence or the threatening nature to really pull that off as he is currently written. So, to make Kylo a more formidable figure, right after he kills Snoke, and he and Rey fight off the Imperial Guards together, just like in the film, Kylo reveals a little bit more of how he's been premeditating and planning for this assassination of Snoke for quite some time. In his post-fight discussion with Rey, he tells her that he's had a recognition about the Force, that for thousands of years there's been all this talk of balance, when really what is needed is unity. No longer must there be Jedi and Sith engaged in endless battles, but rather there must be something new and better, a coming together of light and dark without all the back and forth from before, a new order. The death of Snoke is part of Kylo's long-term plan and something that he has been planning for years after he had learned all that he could from him. The death of Snoke brings an end to the Sith, and once he rids the universe of Luke Skywalker, there will be no more Jedi either. The past will be wiped away, and a new glorious future of unity in the Force will lie before them. All he needs now is for Rey to join him as a representative of the light, and this new future can begin to be realized. Of course, Rey resists Kylo, and maybe they even have a brief lightsaber fight right here. But this time, one that shows that Kylo is much stronger than Rey. He's had much more training, of course, and so that ultimately she goes down and Kylo stands over her threateningly and warning that he doesn't want to have to destroy her. At which time we can cut back to... Alright, so I'm not really a big fan of all the casino and mutant horse racing stuff, but I'm trying to work within the framework of the existing film as much as possible. So we'll leave all that pretty much as is. Instead, let's fast forward to the part after Finn and Rose and Del Toro's hacker have successfully got on board the capital ship and disabled what is now the hyperspace nullifier. Everyone gets captured, and Phasma shows up, just like she does in the film. Here's the script change I would propose at this point to make her character seem more meaningful, and also to make Finn's role more important. When Phasma sees Finn, she addresses him by his old serial number that he had back when he was a stormtrooper. She tells him that, even though he may not know it, he's actually done some great work in the service of the New Order. Of course, Finn and Rose are confused by this, so Phasma further explains that once she discovered he was a traitor who had been taken in by the rebels, that she looked him up in the stormtrooper databases. From there, it has been an easy thing to track his biosignature from world to world and from ship to ship. Finn didn't know it, but he has been a rebel spy all along because they know that where he goes, that's where they'll find the resistance. All those rebel deaths are on his head. Once a stormtrooper, always a stormtrooper. And now, out of recognition of his contributions to the destruction of the Resistance, she will allow him to be reprogrammed back into rejoining the New Order. Finn is really upset by all this, and Rose tries to reassure him. Of course, Finn refuses Captain Phasma's offer. So Phasma says, "Fine, have it your way. You will then meet a traitor's death." And they prepare for the execution, just like in the film. Note that this little addition tightens things up for later in the film, where Finn is willing to sacrifice himself to the battering ram cannon as a way to atone for his guilt. It also explains why Rose would be so bent on saving him from doing so. It also ties into why Finn was in the infirmary earlier, and explains why the New Order has been so successful in hunting down the Resistance. Finally, it adds a whole lot of oomph and emotion to the fight scene that erupts between Finn and Phasma a few moments later. Alright, so hopefully, because of the threat of a spy from the beginning of the film, it makes more sense why Admiral Holdo wouldn't simply tell Poe their plans to evacuate the cruiser via transports when he begins his mutiny. Also, when Leia comes back from her comatose state to get everything back on track, it makes a little more sense now too. So now, let's make just a few small script changes to improve the deaths of a few key characters. First, because the capital ship is bearing down on the remaining rebel cruiser, and it looks like the team won't be able to shut down the hyperdrive nullifier in time, Leia makes the call for the transport evacuation. As part of that evacuation, Holdo ends up on one transport and Leia on another. And rather than having Holdo stay behind to pilot the cruiser, let's have Admiral Akbar do it. We can justify this by saying that his injuries from the earlier attack were so severe that he's likely to die anyway. As you know, due to hacker Del Toro's betrayal, the New Order is aware of the transport evacuation plans. And so, just like in the film, once they're all away, they start picking them off. One small change here would be that the transports are so far out of range that it takes a moment to get a lock on each of them individually, and then the capital ship must fire some long-range homing torpedoes to destroy them. So now we can have some tense moments as the torpedoes home in and start blowing up the transports one by one. One of those torpedo salvos winds up targeting the transport carrying Leia and Poe. The tension builds as it looks like they're done for, but then just in the nick of time, Admiral Holdo and her team interpose their transport to take the torpedo hits. They send a last-minute message to Leia's transport, something like, "Leia is the heart of the Resistance, and so we will willingly sacrifice ourselves for that noble cause. May the Force be," before they are cut off and destroyed. As this is going on, we've got Akbar left alone back up in the cruiser. He sees what has happened and is silently despondent. But then he sees that the nullifier has been disabled and the ability to jump to hyperspace has returned. The rebel team on the New Order capital ship has been successful. Akbar thinks for a second and then begins to turn the cruiser around. Hux is informed of the cruiser's change, but he tells everyone to ignore it. The transports don't have light speed capability, so stay focused on destroying every last one. Akbar brings the cruiser around to Bear, punches the newly restored hyperdrive button, and says quietly, "It's a trap," as he blasts through the capital ship in that brilliant display we probably all thought looked pretty cool, and throws everything in the New Order fleet into chaos. This, of course, is also how Rey escapes, and how Finn and Rose can get away too. Alright, so finally we get to the end of the film. We keep all the stuff with the walkers and the fight to stop the battering ram cannon much the same. We also have Luke show up to make peace with Leia, only now it's the real Luke and not some weird projection of him. He's really there at the last Rebel base. Pretty much everything plays out here the same as before, with Luke going outside to face down the walkers to buy time for the remaining resistance forces to escape. Kylo still tries to destroy him by having everyone fire on him, and Luke still walks out of that fire. So Kylo goes down to face him, and they have pretty much the same fight as before, with Kylo discovering that the Luke he's fighting really is only a projection, which maintains consistency as to why he could survive so much heavy laser fire. Kylo is incredibly angry when he discovers Luke's ruse, but he knows that Luke must be nearby. He can sense him. So he screams out, "Come out and face me, you coward!" Luke, the real Luke in his aged form, comes out. Luke says something like, "You're not the only one who has learned a few tricks from Snoke." Kylo is beside himself and they get into a real lightsaber battle with real danger. Of course, this is all part of Luke's stalling tactic so that the rebels are able to be rescued by Rey and Chewie in the Millennium Falcon. As they are flying overhead making their final escape, Luke looks up and sees the Falcon overhead. In turn, Rey, and possibly Leia, too look down and see him on the field below. Luke smiles a little and then pulls an Obi-Wan. He shuts off his saber and lets Kylo run him through while they watch. But just like with Obi-Wan's death, Luke isn't really there, and all that is left for Kylo is Luke's robe and his cloak fluttering away in the breeze. Rey, of course, freaks out. No! Kylo then looks up to see the Falcon just as it jumps away to hyperspeed. And then from there, we can wrap the movie pretty much as it ended. Okay, so that's it. My 12 small script changes that I think would have saved The Last Jedi for fans, while still being true to all the main plot points that we've seen in the film. I don't think that any of this takes away from what people liked, but it also gently realigns the movie to feel more like the Star Wars that we've come to know and love. But what do you think? Do you agree? If these little script changes had been made, do you think The Last Jedi would have been a better film? And until next time, may the Force be with you.